We now move towards our first plenary for the day, which is Accelerating Climate Markets. Don't forget to hashtag IFC Markets. Once again, I'll keep reminding you through the day. I now call on stage Mr. Kiran Stacey, South Asia correspondent of Financial Times, based in Delhi, to introduce the panels and the moderators. Welcome.
Is this mic on? Yes, it is. Thank you very much. My name is Kiran Stacey. I'm the South Asia correspondent for the Financial Times. I've been living and working here in Delhi for just over a year, and one of my specialisms is energy and climate change. So it's been amazing, really, for me to see, coming from the UK, where we think, we're a sizable market and a big economy with major climate challenges and big business opportunities, then you come to India and get a real sense of the scale of both the challenge and the opportunities that are presenting themselves from climate change. Climate change is a problem. It is also an opportunity, as we're seeing from the IFC report this morning. It can offer substantial returns for companies that invest in the right technologies for the future. The report this morning shows the investment potential in the 6 countries that make up South Asia could be as large as $1.5 trillion from 2018 to 2030. Green buildings and green transport alone account for $950 billion of that. But of course, there are risks, from unpredictable technology to poorly designed regulation. So to help us set the tone for this conference and to navigate our way through the investment minefield, let me introduce our panel for this morning's session. Shall I do it one by one, and then each person can come up? Does that make sense? All right. So first of all, Nena Stoiljkovic is one of 2 vice presidents for global practices at the World Bank Group. Her role involves bringing together people from across the group and outside partners to help tackle the world's most pressing developmental challenges. She's worked in Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, Southern Europe, and Central Asia, so is ideally placed to set the South Asia picture and challenge in a global context. Welcome. Pati Singhania is a 4th-generation business leader at one of India's largest industrial groups, the JK Organization. He holds an MBA from the University of Massachusetts and is an alumnus of Harvard Business School. Punit Lalbhai is Executive Director of Arvind Limited. He's currently working on building new businesses for the company, such as advanced materials, engineering, and agribusiness. He has an MBA from INSEAD in France and a master's in environmental science from Yale. Lord Stern, Baron Stern of Brentford, or Nick, as he is known to most, won't need much introduction to anyone involved in tackling climate change. He is a professor at the London School of Economics, a former chief economist at the World Bank, a former president of the British Academy, and was the author of the famous Stern Review, which warned that failing to tackle climate change would cost the global economy at least 5% of its GDP every year. His latest book is Why Are We Waiting? The Logic, Urgency, and Promise of Tackling Climate Change. Thank you all for being with us. Nena, could I start with you? Maybe you've worked pretty much in every region of the world. Maybe you could give us something of a global overview of what is happening here and around the world to tackle climate change and the opportunities that are arising from that.
Thank you for having me here. And if I may, I just wanted to correct my title. I did run global practices of the World Bank a few years back, but now I'm in charge of blended finance and partnerships in IFC. So just a small correction here. It's a great pleasure to be here with so many of you representatives of the private sector and the esteemed panelists. We already heard, and you said it, and the Honorable Minister said it, that climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our times. And I also believe that this generation, we have to solve it, because if we don't, it will be too late. It was already mentioned that 3 out of 5 most vulnerable countries to climate shocks actually are in South Asia. And for me, it's great to be here in New Delhi, in the heart of South Asia, to have this conversation. As you all know, I mean, South Asia is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. And for that growth to be sustainable, all the infrastructure that has to be built, all the buildings and all the other sectors will have to be developed in a more sustainable way. And there is some urgency around that, because if we don't do it, supply chains will get disrupted, communities will be affected, commodity prices will be more vulnerable. And when we look at how much of infrastructure has to be built in the next 13 years up to 2030, we're talking about $90 trillion. And then you mentioned it yourself, just in...
This is the mic center.
Okay, here? Okay. You mentioned it just in... I can hold it like this. Okay, thanks. Just in South Asia, you mentioned the green vehicles, $610 billion, green buildings that need to be built, 1.5 trillions, etc. And the only way how this will all be built is through the private sector, because private sector has the money, and private sector, as already mentioned, will bring that innovation. Honorable Minister mentioned solutions, and that's why I think it's very exciting to have so many of you here from the private sector to think through a series of panels, all oriented towards specific sector on how all of this is going to happen. Alsbeta mentioned the study that we did last year at the COP22 in Morocco, where we looked at 21 countries that made commitment to climate action. Through NDCs, where we identified in those 21 countries a $23 trillion opportunity for climate investments in the next 13 to 15 years. And the good news is that some of this is already happening, and the current market for particular sectors, renewable energy, green buildings, urban infrastructure, and climate smart agri is already 1 trillion. But we still have way to go to get to the 23 trillions. And for that, not only the private sector, as I mentioned, but also governments will have to play a significant role. We need policies that are conducive to climate investments so that private sector actually can have confidence and certainty to come in. I wanted to mention a little bit about IFC and what we are doing, because my perspective here on this panel is going to be from an international finance institution perspective. We can definitely work through our colleagues in the World Bank on supporting the governments in making those right policy changes and investment climate for investments. We can also, I think the minister mentioned that we can help de-risk some of the private sector opportunities in climate through some of the blended finance instruments, guarantees. And we can also use some innovative ways of mobilizing significant capital from other investors, in particular institutional investors who have the trillions that we can turn into investments in climate opportunities. IFC can also provide a lot of building capacity, both to governments and clients through advisory services, helping them structure some of the PPPs, especially in the renewable energy, like we did with Reva Solar here in India. We can also work with local banks to support their financing of climate projects. And I can talk a little bit more about all these instruments and specific innovative financial tools a little bit later. But I just wanted to say that there is a role for all of us in the room here, a role for the governments on the policies, role of the IFIs like IFC on unlocking some of that potential and helping structure some of those transactions in climate friendly way, and of course the role for the private sector that will bring the innovation and bring the financing to these projects.
Thank you very much. Harsh, could you tell us from a private sector point of view what your organization is doing in this field?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think, there are several aspects of this. I think we're all, first of all, as citizens, concerned about the impacts of climate change. As individuals, as human beings, as the minister said. And then when we look at ourselves as corporate citizens, we also say what impact business is having on this whole thing. But I think the good news is essentially that there is a lot that business can do and what it has been doing. And I think the new technologies that are being utilized in creating businesses and industry, and I talk more from a manufacturing sector perspective, are much more environment friendly to begin with. So there is a lot of technology which is far more sustainable, which is embedded in today's era. I can, I mean, everybody would have examples, but I can speak from our own. We are largely a manufacturing group which are in many different businesses. But for example, in our pulp and paper business, and pulp and paper is usually seen to be not such a climate-friendly business, but I think the industry does a poor job of communicating its positive sides. So for example, we made a major expansion about 4 years ago, and we find that we have been able to reduce our specific water consumption by half. We have been able to reduce our specific energy consumption at that facility by about 43%. We have been able to improve on a whole lot of efficiency parameters. Now, part of what the paper industry does in India is that we do a lot of plantations. So, for example, through farmers. So we give saplings to farmers for them to plant on their lands, which we then buy. And today, we do about 70 to 80 million saplings every year that we give to farmers. And the result of that today is that we are a wood positive company. That is, we actually grow or help grow more wood that we use in our business. If we look at carbon sequestration, this entire green plantations helps in sequestering carbon dioxide, acts as a big sink. And therefore, we have seen, for example, we did a recent study and we've seen some astonishing figures, maybe from a smaller base, that says that in the last 4 years, the amount of carbon sequestration has gone up by as much as 400%. So there is a lot of impact that this can be, that can be brought about. If I look at some of our other businesses, we have been able to reduce energy consumption in our cement business. We recover a lot of energy through waste heat gases or waste heat that is produced in the cement industry. And I see my colleagues from the cement industry nodding. So I'm sure we all know that that is done. And similarly, our focus on renewables. So depending on our businesses, whether cement, tires, or other manufacturing, anywhere from about 25% to 60% of our energy is now produced from renewable sources, a variety of renewable sources. And our target is to increase that even further. So I think in sum and substance that there is an opportunity here for businesses to grow more profitably because they are much more efficient and at the same time become much more environment friendly. So I'll stop here with these initial remarks and then we can get into things later.
Thank you very much. Punit, could you also tell us, from your point of view, you're involved in advanced engineering and materials, what kind of opportunities do you see here?
So I think it's a pleasure to be here. It's a topic that is very close to my heart, and so I'm going to enjoy this discussion. I would like to spend a few minutes talking about textiles and what is happening in textiles. Textiles falls within, I think, the top 5 industries as far as environmental footprint goes. It's extremely water hungry and it's extremely energy hungry. And while there have been a lot of sort of bright lights, pockets of excellence, as an industry, only the last 5 years have started seeing significant change in a way that sustainability is coming front and center of how we think about textiles. And there are a few trends that I'd like to talk about that I think would be useful to think about, and other industries can also, learn from what's happening. I think there has been a move from individual excellence to try and think about sustainability through cooperation. An example I'd like to talk about is the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, where everybody that's important in the textile value chain, and the movement is headed by brands, but also includes manufacturers, fiber producers, growers, civil society, academia, to first of all create a common language of sustainability, and then create that language in such a way that it creates a race to the top, where your sustainability improvements are measured, you are anonymously benchmarked, and then that benchmarking leads to dramatic amount of improvement. And we've seen that when brands took the red line approach, where they audited you and they said that, you have to be above a certain threshold, it created incentives to be just above the threshold and also created perverse incentives to game the system. But in this benchmarking model and a race to the top, where it's a discussion and you're benchmarked against your peers, we've seen that the investments made in improving the sustainability performance has dramatically performed better, and we've seen fast sort of growth of investments in this. I think coming to textiles, what we have not successfully done is access carbon markets, and we're constantly scanning. However, we haven't seen, we've not yet been able to make the carbon markets attractive enough to tap into. Instead, we've focused on, there's so much work to be done within, within our supply chains with technology advancing, that we focused on energy efficiency. Specific energies are coming down, consumptions of water are coming down. We've focused on product innovation, where textiles hasn't changed for 100 years. But in the last 5 years, we've started seeing technologies that eliminate spinning and weaving altogether to go from fiber to garment in one step, thereby removing most of the environmental impact. We've seen waterless dyeing technologies emerge and start to get adopted. This needs to happen at a further pace. And we've now started to see closed loop manufacturing cycles where you can make fiber from clothes. So from clothes to clothes without any or very little input of virgin material. So these are all positive trends. And we look forward to now, at some point, the low-hanging fruit is going to get exhausted. So I think at that point in time, financial instruments, carbon markets will become very, very relevant. And we're keenly awaiting the progress in these areas, and especially initiatives from the government and policy side that will make this happen in the near future.
Thank you very much. Nick, we're now over a decade from your review. We're a couple of years after Paris. We hear a lot of optimism here in the room from the private sector about the opportunities that are there. I don't know how optimistic you're feeling right now, but maybe you can give us the view from an economist perspective of where we are.
Thank you very much, Kiran. Is my microphone working in the back there? Can you hear me? Yep, thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking the IFC for drawing us all together, and you can see in this room the strength of the interest that's there. And I'd also like to thank those in India who have contributed to my own chair at the LSE, the I.G. Patel chair, which is the Reserve Bank of India, State Bank of India, and Yes Bank. I'm optimistic, Kiran, about what we can do on the basis of the Paris Agreement. I worry about what we will do, but we can do a tremendous amount. We can achieve the Paris Agreement, and we can make ourselves much more sustainably prosperous in the process. So our job, and the job of this kind of gathering, is to work out how we do it. But that is founded on conviction that you can, and I'm sure many people in the room will speak to that, and I will speak to that also. Let me begin with the Paris Agreement itself. Of course, it was founded on a deep understanding, or a still deeper understanding, of the immense risks of climate change. We're already now at temperatures which are on the borderline of the Holocene period, the period since the last ice age, 10,000 years ago, when we developed as a community. That was plus or minus 1 degree centigrade. That was the very benign climate that led us to turn grains into grass and have villages and where you wait for the harvest to come, to have storage, have surpluses so that you could have universities and newspapers. This is a very special period in human history, plus or minus 1 degree centigrade, and we're on the edge of that. 3 degrees centigrade, which is where we're headed on the basis of the contributions which are targeted for 2030 by Paris, 3 degrees we haven't seen for 3 million years, when sea levels were tens of meters higher than today. It would rewrite where people could live and how they could live, and hundreds of millions would have to move, and the result would likely be severe conflict. Very important, I won't dwell on it, but it's very important to see the stakes for which we're playing. That recognition of those stakes was one reason we got the Paris Agreement. But the second one was, and this is very different from the attempt to get an agreement in Copenhagen 6 years earlier. The difference was people now understood that the transition to the low-carbon economy is the growth story. The investments will drive growth now. The new technologies and innovations that will come over the medium term will be a real wave of technological change, as Joseph Schumpeter described, and there is no high-carbon growth strategy. Any attempt would destroy itself on the hostile environment it would create. So we got Paris because that growth theory, that growth understanding was there. And that's fundamental, and what's so important is that we demonstrate that still more strongly than we have been up to now, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. The second point I wanted to make, it's already been touched on, but I'll do it in a slightly different way. The second point I wanted to make was scale. The world economy at a growth rate of 3% roughly will double in the next couple of decades or so, the next 20, 25 years. The infrastructure of the world will more than double in the next 20 years. So here's the question. Does that new economy coming along look anything like the old one? Does that more than doubling of infrastructure look anything like the old lot that we have at the moment? If the answer is yes, we're in deep trouble. And 3 degrees would probably be out of reach, let alone the wise Paris target of well below 2 degrees. This is about scale and urgency, and we have to recognize the urgency. Sometimes when you give people that little piece of arithmetic to say that we're more than doubling infrastructure, doubling the economy in 2 decades, at a time when we have to cut emissions absolutely by 20%, they say, yes, of course, I understand you, Nick, and then they go on talking as if you haven't said anything. And the urgency is something that we have to recognize. It means going sustainable right across the board. Power sector, of course, but we've already heard examples here way beyond the power sector, and that is extremely important. It's also important to recognize that probably 70% of that extra infrastructure will be in Asia. We're in the right place to talk about these issues, and we have to see infrastructure, meaning energy, transport, and water particularly, at the heart of this story. So Asian infrastructure and how it develops over the next 20 years will largely shape the future of our people, the future of the planet. So let's recognize the stakes we're playing for, but let's be cheerful, because if we do it well, we will have an extraordinary, attractive society. We'd have cities where you can move, breathe, and be productive. That sounds like a good idea, even if you've never heard of climate change. It's compelling, of course, if you have heard of climate change, and we have indeed heard of climate change. So that's the scale of the story, the growth story, and the observation that infrastructure in Asia is of absolutely central importance to this whole thing. The third and last thing I want to do is to talk about what business can do. We're going to hear lots of specific examples. We've heard some important specific examples already, and they will come during the day. I want to talk about what business can do from the point of view of helping set policy. If you're a professor at the LSE and you go and see a finance minister, often they're very interested, sympathetic even, but will they necessarily act on your advice? Maybe, maybe not. But if businesses go to finance ministers and say, we've got tremendous opportunities here, we will invest, but we can only invest on the back of good policy. We can only invest on policy which recognizes greenhouse gas pollution, recognizes air particulates and their pollution, which recognizes that innovation has to happen. If you can put those policies in place, then we will invest. We're already doing a bit, even though policies aren't so good, but we could do so much more. That kind of example, we don't want to eliminate the professors from the London School of Economics, but that kind of example can be very powerful and rightly powerful. That's business helping to make policy, not in terms of going to North Block and saying, please do me a favor. That's not the kind of policy making I'm talking about. It's about right across the economy in a clear and long-lasting way getting policies right. Long-lasting policies does not mean rigid policies, because we're going to learn so much as we go. It means credible policies. It means policies that are predictably flexible. So in other words, policies where, as we learn, the understandings on how policy changes will be there. And in Europe, we've made some big mistakes by suddenly switching off policy when we realize how successful it's been. And then, of course, you put people in real difficulty. You've got to be predictably flexible. As the costs come down, as these technologies diffuse across the economy, we will gradually reduce the support for those kinds of policies. That's the kind of thing I mean by predictably flexible. But of course, the policies themselves have to be right. We have to look for prices or regulations to manage carbon, prices or regulations to manage air pollution, incentives for innovation, and so on. Those policies have to be got right. I'll be saying more in my intervention this afternoon, so I won't dwell on them. But I wanted to underline the importance of business in helping to set good policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of our panelists. If you could all be thinking of some questions, I'm going to open this session up to the floor in a second, but I was just hoping to ask each of you just one or two things of my own. If you don't mind, I'm going to take journalist privilege here and quiz you a little bit myself. Nena, one thing that struck me while I've been reporting here in India is the enthusiasm, particularly around large-scale solar. The scale of the projects is growing and the prices are just dropping through the floor. You know, people are now talking about tariffs which are competitive with coal, which is obviously a pretty amazing thing. But one of the other things that people talk about is there might actually be over-exuberance in the market, that companies might be bidding prices now which are so low these projects are not sustainable. How can you, I know that the IFC is invested in some of these projects directly, but just from a global point of view, how do you make sure that you're A, investing in the right projects, and B, doing so in a way that isn't going to end up, you know, funding a white elephant and money being wasted and confidence dropping in this kind of market?
My colleagues from India would be able probably during the later panels today to talk about the specifics of the Indian solar market. But we take pride that we were part of one of the largest single-site solar projects here in India, Reva, with a capacity of 750 megawatts of solar power. And there, when you use a bit of blended finance to de-risk the project and remove some of the externalities that have to be removed in order for this project to be viable. Actually, there is no issue in somewhat lower tariffs. What worked there also is that you had a direct purchase of power rather than going through the intermediaries. So overall, you achieved a more efficient operation. Globally, we have resorted to some of the de-risking instruments, especially blended finance, on the first of its kind type of solar projects in a country where you would actually make a demonstration effect to others who plan to invest. And as Nick said, you would push also the governments to make the relevant changes in the policies, and then the market would kind of sort it out, and the next set of projects would not need any de-risking in most cases, or any blended finance. And along the way, we would invest a lot in building capacity. For example, in REVA, we advise the government on how to structure the bidding process, and how and what provisions to put in the contract. And it was a record time that the project actually closed after only 11 months. And that's what we do in most of the projects, as I said, usually pioneering, first of its kind, solar, where we would also provide a lot of advice in addition to financing.
Okay, thank you very much. Harsh, you were talking about some of your work with farmers and agribusiness, and the role that plays in manufacturing. I was interested in what you were saying about the project with the saplings. But one thing that strikes me, we've just been through, in the last few weeks, the worst air pollution Delhi has ever seen. And the reason for that, or much of the reason for that, appears to be farmers burning their crops up in Punjab, up in Haryana, and the complete inability of policymakers to be able to do anything about this. For people, for example, farmers who are potentially living on the breadline, who are working with very, very thin margins, how do you persuade them to take action which might be quite expensive, which might only pay off over a long period of time, but are absolutely necessary to improve the environment? Are there ways of doing that? Or do you simply need government to come in and fund these kind of schemes instead?
That's a tough one, because it's not an easy problem to resolve, because, as you said, the farmers have their own livelihoods. And the problem with this whole crop burning thing, as I understand it, and I'm no expert at it, is that the window between doing that and the next plantation is so short, anywhere just about 2 to 3 weeks, that this exercise happens. Now, I think that there has to be intervention at multiple levels. Clearly, at the policymakers' level and the government's level, in trying to help farmers in finding alternate means. There are technologies for that, but they are more expensive. So partly that has to come in as a solution. Partly, I believe there has to be the development of usage of that stubble itself, in terms of agri-waste, agri-residue, and doing something about it and processing it. I know, for example, that's not with the stubble, but with wheat and grass, wheat and rice straw, etc. India is one of the largest producers, and of course sugarcane, what is called bagasse, sugarcane remain. After you take out the juice, India is perhaps the largest producers and users of these kinds of waste materials for paper making. And in fact, I think about almost 20–25% of the fiber that's sourced in India comes from these sources in paper making. Surprisingly, almost 50% of fiber used is recycled, by the way, as people don't think of that too much in terms of India. So coming back to the issue, I think there will have to be multi-pronged solutions in terms of some kind of help to farmers from government and from the government side, be it subsidies, be it other economic means, etc., generating businesses out of using that part of it, and also just over a period educating farmers on some of this, and looking at alternate crop fashions also in this. So that's part of the issue. But may I turn back into a couple of things? And for example, you talked about, I'll tell you the example from our own industry. When we started doing plantation with farmers, it was not very attractive for them, but we needed to do it for our own purposes. And the farmers would actually plant the saplings on non-productive land, which they would continue to do, but that reduced yields. But we have worked with farmers over a period to educate them, tell them that this is also good for you economically. And we on our own have done a lot of work on clonal technology, which means today, instead of harvesting tropical woods, the kinds for pulpwood, which might have been 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, we are now down to a 3 to 4 year cycle. And we have actually experimented with some wood which might be able to be done within less than 3 years. So we have also had to work on the back end as an industry in R&D to say, okay, this is a proposition which is economically beneficial to you compared to planting some other crop, including crops like cotton in some areas where we compete in Gujarat and other places. So it has to be a multi-pronged approach, I think, that comes back to this. If I may also jump to one other thing that you asked about solar, if I may just jump in on that. My view is that, yes, I think there is concern that some of the projects have been bid down to fairly silly levels, if you will say. But I think, you know, the cost, because again of technology, costs of production for the panels, the entire system, as well as the scale, and that's something that you talked about in a different context. The scale of work that is being done enables prices to be driven down. And I believe that water will find its own level. Our bigger issue, and you know, India, I think for the first time in history, has added more renewable power than it has added thermal power in 16, 17. That itself is a huge, huge shift. Our solar capacity has increased by 370% in the last 3 years, and wind capacity by about 52%. So there is clearly a lot of work happening in this area, and you know, some of the equations will even out.
Thank you very much. Nick, Punit was talking about the low-hanging fruit eventually being exhausted in terms of investments and business opportunities, and the importance of having carbon markets. And I guess functional carbon trading is what you're talking about there. We've seen in Europe in particular carbon markets not working at all for various reasons. How important do you think as an economist having some kind of carbon trading scheme is going to be to meet the Paris targets? And how far are we away from getting functioning carbon markets?
I'll speak directly to that, Kiran, but could I just add one word on the stubble burning? It's a classic example of a market failure where good policies could produce a market solution. And I do this on the back of working for nearly 40 years, sorry, more than 40 years in one small village in West UP, eastern side of West UP in Moradabad district. We all know that when you harvest with a sickle, you harvest right down at the bottom, right at the ground level. If you harvest with a combine harvester, then it's higher, and you've got the stubble. So in a sense, this is a problem arising particularly from the use of combine harvesters, combined with, as you mentioned, sir, the more intensive agriculture requiring smaller gaps between harvesting and the next crop. And there are technological solutions to that. I mean, you have the so-called happy seeder, which seeds at the same time as it deals with the stubble, for example, by ploughing it back in as mulch. Now, that activity is very good for all of us, particularly those who live in Delhi, but the farmers don't get the money for that. So in the early stages, it seems to me, some kind of strong support for that kind of happy seeder would make sense, and the right kind of finance and sharing arrangements, because there are lots and lots of small plots, and they won't necessarily make sense to all of them buy one of these things. So you need mechanisms for doing that. In the village I've been working, there are maybe 20 tractors, and there's a good market for leasing out those tractors. It could be the same thing. But that market needs to develop, and I do think that public policy, the state level, the union level, could well advance that. So that's an example of where you've got a problem. It's a newish problem. It's, to some extent it's been there, but it's more intense now with combine harvesters and more intensive agriculture. But there's a way of dealing with it, which is a combination of the technology, the organization of markets, the right kind of finance, and so on. But you asked about carbon prices. I published a report, or at least a committee which I co-chaired with good friend Joseph Stiglitz, published a report in May, collaborating with the World Bank on carbon prices. And we argued, and many of us would argue, that they're a very important part of the story. And they have to be a good deal higher than they are now. Probably now you might only have somewhere between 10 and 15% of the world's emissions covered in any way by a carbon price, and those carbon prices on average being quite low. That over the next 5 or 10 years could rise to 25% as China's carbon markets develop, as markets in Central and Southern America develop. So those are coming. So the answer to your question is they're very important. They don't have a big coverage at the moment, and the prices are not high enough, but they're moving in the right direction. And even Europe is moving in the right direction. They finally discovered that if you put too many carbon permits on the market, then you crash the price. You don't have to be a professor of economics at the LSE to work that out. But fortunately, Europe is doing a bit better, and they will be withdrawing permits from the market, pushing up the price probably to 15 euros or so a ton over the next 5 or 10 years. So they are very important, and we should work to make people face the costs of what they do. That's, after all, how markets are supposed to allocate resources in efficient ways. But they only do it if people are faced with the cost of what they do. So it's a very important part of the process, but it can't be that alone that determines this. I mean, let me give you one, and many reasons why. Let me give you one reason, which is city design. A carbon price would not lead very rapidly to the redesign of cities. It might have a little twist in a good direction, but fundamentally you have to redesign the cities. You have to have much better public transport. You have to have electric vehicles and electric charging points. You have to make life easier for bicycles and so on. That's the kind of way that you have to bring in the other policies to complement the carbon prices. Regulation can be a substitute for carbon prices. I mean, to say that you won't have any hydrocarbon-fueled vehicles sold after 2030, which is what we have as the target in India, that's a very good regulation, which can have a very powerful effect. So carbon price is very important. We are moving in the right direction, not fast enough, but we are moving in the right direction, but not by carbon prices alone.
Thank you very much. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm not sure, have we got some questions also coming in, I think, on the app? So we'll take some from there as well. There's a hand raised just there, if we can get a microphone to that person. When you ask your question, if you could just introduce yourself, and please make the question relatively brief, and a question rather than a speech would be great.
Thank you. My name is Damandeep. I work with the Carbon Disclosure Project. My question is to Lord Stern. You talk about business taking action and driving policy. We've seen some evidence of the companies that report to CDP. My question really is is there a regional distinction in that? Because we've also heard by some government officials to say that CBDR should also apply to business action. My question really is, does business action need to be different in different regions to make an impact? Do different businesses have different responsibilities?
I think there's a general observation which I try to make, which applies to all countries. We know that the bulk of investment will be private sector investment. We know that such investment is very strongly influenced by the investment climate, by the investment climate which shapes the risks and returns associated with projects, associated with the investments. And the businesses know in a very clear way what it is that's troubling in the investment climate. So I think it's true of all places that this kind of interaction on what makes for good policy is a very important part of policy itself. Now, the nature of the interactions will depend on the different kind of polities, countries that you're in. In some places, most of the action is at the center. In other places, most of the action would be at a lower level in terms of what shapes the environment for business. But I think the observation I made about business contributing to the discussion of the investment climate, business showing what's possible if the investment climate is right and the policy is right, I think that's a general observation.
Okay. Are there any other questions from the floor? Yes, can we get a microphone to this man here just at the front?
I'm Mahendra Singhi from Dalmia Bharat Group. I have two questions to Lord Stern. One, as per Paris Agreement and as per Marrakesh Partnership, whether it will be possible to have CDM projects extended pre-2020.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Pre-2020, whether CDM projects would get extended. Like in Paris Agreement and in Marrakesh Partnership, there was an agreement that developed countries should come forward. And second is the commitment of developed countries to give $100 billion for Green Climate Fund, whether that would be coming up. Thank you.
What's the question on the climate fund, sorry?
That one.
Whether it will happen.
Yes.
Right, good question.
Yes. I hope the CDM does continue for a bit, but I'm not really in a position to predict exactly how that will develop. I have not been close to that particular discussion. I was pretty close to the $100 billion a year discussion, on the other hand, because I was involved directly. I was helping the negotiations on the side of the developing countries. And Prime Minister Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia was a key figure in those discussions in Copenhagen in 2009. And I was negotiating with Mike Froman, who was working very closely with Hillary Clinton. So I was deeply involved with that 100 billion story, and Meles Zenawi and I was pushing for 100 billion, all public money. And of course, we knew what would happen. Somebody put public, insert, and private, and it became public and private flows. But I would have preferred it to have been public flows. And then right after that, I was on there was a commission chaired by Meles Zenawi and Gordon Brown and Stoltenberg, Prime Minister of Norway, to look at ways of generating that 100 billion. And we suggested some slice of revenue from carbon markets and increasing the finance capacity of the multilateral development banks. The revenue from carbon markets is obviously not very high, but I do think that there should be a major increase in the lending of the multilateral development banks as a big part of the contribution to those flows. And I'm working very hard to try to bring that into fruition. There have been various attempts to count the flows, and one by the OECD suggested that we might be doing a half or two-thirds of those flows around the time of 2015, but that's counting quite a lot of private flows in that story. So we do need to ramp that up, and I think increasing lending through the MDBs is the most likely and attractive way of doing this in the medium term. But I wanted to put this in the overall picture. Infrastructure investment in the world is over $3 trillion. Over the next 15, 20 years, it will rise to $6, $7, $8 trillion. Most of that, the big bulk of the increase, in the emerging market and developing countries. So the 100 billion, however it comes, or if it comes, is only a small part of that story. I think that the multilateral development banks working with the private sector with big multipliers of 3 or 4 or more could actually help private sector contribute in a very strong way to that story.
Nena, do you want to come in on
Yes,
that?
if I may. Nick said it very well, but what I wanted to say is that what we are trying to work on as multilateral development banks is to maximize mobilization around $1 of a grant or a public financing or ODA. And what IFC has been able to do is to use $1 of those blended finance platforms to generate about $14 for each of that dollars of total investment. And that's how we look at the Green Climate Fund as well. Right now, it's a little bit less than $10 billion, as I understand, through the first commitments. We are just getting an agreement signed with them, and we hope that GCF will be making decisions so that it can maximize its pool of funds and get much more mobilization in terms of total financing. And IFC has worked with other MDBs and DFIs to set some common principles for blended finance so that we don't undermine each other, we don't compete for each project, but we actually unlock the market potential. And some of those principles are around minimal concessionality, including the one that will come from green climate funds, dealing with negative externalities, being very clear on the reasons for using blended finance, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we all need to watch how these funds are used, because without discipline, it can really, really create more problems than solutions.
When you talk about blended finance, what exactly do you mean, especially in the climate change?
In any case, but especially in climate, because this is the first kind of sector where we started using blended finance about 10 years ago. What we define as blended finance, and now that has been accepted on these principles together with all the other MDBs, when you actually use donor funds to blend them, mix them with your own more commercial funds. That's what we call blended finance. And what I wanted to say is that IFC has never used even donor funds as pure grants. We always try to generate, as a minimum, return the principal to the donors, and in some cases generate some returns, of course concessional in comparison with our commercial financing.
Punit, from the private sector point of view, we're talking a lot about the macro and global policy. How much does this stuff affect what you do as a company? And you were talking about textiles, for example, and the need to become more efficient simply to help the bottom line, simply to help profitability. Would that be the case even if the Paris Agreement wasn't there, even if all these government schemes and frameworks weren't in place? Did these opportunities exist, whatever?
So the answer is yes and no. I think all of this helps build the narratives that then contribute to the bottom line. So finally, it's a consumer wanting to buy a green product, in the case of textiles,
right.
That makes the machinery move forward.
Yep.
And start adding to the bottom line. So because we are having Paris, because we are having government policy in the right place, it becomes then easier to move in that direction. So it shapes narratives, it removes obstacles from the path, but I think finally human behavior and economics is going to win the day. So I think policy and the larger narrative will have to sort of align itself well to the basic human behavior of looking for economic gain.
Mm-hmm. One thing that strikes me in the textiles industry in particular is that there is a drive to make clothing more and more cheaply, particularly as the wages of Chinese factory workers go up. Other countries are now coming in trying to undercut those. Obviously, Bangladesh is a big one, India also. When the margins are so slim, how easy is it to do things like invest in greener technology, which might only pay off after several years?
Well, I think that is a myth, that a greener technology takes longer to pay off. I think if you look at textiles, I think 80% of everything sustainable falls into a positive correlation with additional profit. I think where things are mispriced, where there are externalities, that's where we'll have to be more creative. That's where policy comes in. That's where access to creative financial instruments come in. That's where coalition thinking comes in, where you're rewarded for making investments by the buyers. I think we will have to find challenging solutions to the 20%, but the 80%, if I consume less water, if I consume less energy, if I reduce processes, if I bring in game-changing technologies, that's all actually increasing my margin and decreasing it.
Okay, thank you. More questions from the floor. There's a woman here just at the front. Get a microphone to her. Is that microphone working? Can we get another microphone just here, please?
Hi, Sandra Sasso, CIAB Energy. We'll be presenting tomorrow in the last session, but one of my questions to, I guess, the entire panel is we are a small company with a climate influenced solution for the waste sector, so for infrastructure change in future cities. What we're finding is we're working in one region with IFC, funding one of our projects, but then to escalate that and accelerate our access to market, we have to go back in every region separately and address both the legislative access to market, but also the financing that goes around with that. What are you doing to work so that it's cross-region and more global in its approach, so that solutions like mine and others are able to scale and scale more quickly to meet the climate challenges that we have on a global basis?
Nena, your organization is one
yes,
that
no,
does
thank
have
you
this.
for that question. And of course, it's complicated because each country is different. It has, our CEO says it has a different currency, it has different policies, and we have to look at individual countries and the specific country context. The only thing that I can say is probably by the end of tomorrow, by the end of your panel, we will actually have a better response to this. But I wanted to mention one example, which was actually in renewable energy, in solar, where we actually created a platform in a way of replicable approaches. We call it scaling solar, where you would use exactly the same, no matter which country or which project, you would use exactly the same approach. First, advise the government on how to structure PPP contracts, then use a similar type of contracts, use a similar bidding process, etc. And we've done the first scaling solar deal in Zambia, and now we are trying to do another one in Senegal. So we have to be thinking about those scalable, I call them a little bit cookie-cutting solutions, although they always have to be adjusted to the specifics of a specific country.
Kiran, can I just add one thing to that? I think cities working together, I mean, the collaboration between cities is getting better and better now. And if they had common procurement standards, I think that could give part of a contribution. I don't know if it would work in your area, but if the city mayors say that we will demand that all the buses we buy satisfy the following performance criteria, then you could, in that case, get a really big scaled-up market for the buses. But obviously, it depends on the particular sector.
Harsh, how difficult do you find it, even within India, working in different states, different parts of the country with their own regulations and ways of going about business?
I think that's an important point. It starts with different standards sometimes and basic things like emission norms, etc. So in a federal structure like India, of course, you have a central policy, which is from the Central Pollution Control Board, but the states also have their own environmental regulations. And and unfortunately, as you rightly said, it often differs. So you have to obviously meet standards for both the state and the center. But I think the good news is that there seems to be more and more alignment gradually between the different regulations, and maybe driven by the standards that the center is prescribing, as well as from regulations from outside. But I wish to make one point here that in the last several years, a lot of regulations which are coming in from, at least from the industry side, have also been voluntary. So for example, industries have been agreeing to certain standards to be achieved, let's say in the next 5 years, on a graduated basis. And I think the textile industry has also agreed to that. I know the chemical, the sugar industry, paper, and a whole bunch of the cement industry have agreed to these kinds of standards. So that gives you a runway to see. So it's not a change which is happening suddenly, and you say, oh my God, what do I do with my existing investments? So you have a graduated scale by which you are able to reach a particular standard. And I think the government also appreciates the fact that the industry has business has been forthcoming in doing this. But if I may make, we're almost out of time, but if I make one larger remark, I think from an Indian perspective, while we talk a lot about the climate change side, we need to see that we need to balance the legitimate growth ambitions that developing countries have with the entire climate action policy. Because if you look at India, we talk in terms of saying that we are perhaps the 4th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but we are only 4.1%, with a population which is 16% of global population. So you have to do the balancing act, and that goes back to the example that we talked about, the stubble burning.
Thank you very much. Well, on that note, I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap up. We had some pretty good examples there of how regulation, policy, and business all need to act in the same direction to get the kind of outcomes that we're hoping for from the Paris Agreement over the next few years. Thank you all for participating. Please enjoy the conference over the next couple of days. Thank you.